What's going on, everybody, and welcome back to, hopefully at this point, the final one of these uh, yet to be determined episodes of the Book Binge, where I'm reviewing books at a time that I don't know when the videos are coming out. Either way, I am covering The Count of Monte Cristo this week, finally, after reading the majority of it back in March of 2023. So it has been a decently long while since I did this, but it is one of the most beloved classics of all times. Is it really worth the praise that basically everybody seems to give it? Because I feel like if people give their lists of their favorite classics, some of their favorite books of all time even, this will appear on many people's lists. The short answer to whether it's worth it is yes. The long answer to whether it is worth that praise is yes, it is worth that praise. But let's talk about why that actually is. Starting off with the good of The Count of Monte Cristo, we simply have the fact that the story is simultaneously incredibly predictable and not predictable at all. It manages to balance that incredibly well and totally and completely. Like, there were never any points where I felt dissatisfied with a certain twist, and there were plenty of times where it's like you have an idea of where it's going, or you're able to predict where it went, and then it did, but then also did something different with that revelation that you predicted that wasn't the way that you predicted, so therefore it went in a different direction. It's kind of hard to describe, but part of the fun of reading the book is having an idea, or thinking you have an idea of where it's going, and then realizing that you actually don't, and it does something a little bit different, but you're not unhappy about that. Dumas does a very great strikes a very great balance between these aspects, in my opinion. My favorite part of the book is the first 300 pages, and I think most people would describe those first 300 pages, the sort of prison arc, I suppose, are perfect. More than perfect. I think one of my favorite reads of 2023 on its own, if it was just those 300 pages, insanely good stuff. And I think goes forth through basically the rest of the book, proving that Dumas is a master at plotting and pacing and overall laying down of hints. He's just very good at this kind of thing. It's surprisingly good for an author who writes serially, or who wrote serially, who published basically everything serially and was known to write upwards of 3 or 4 novels at once, publishing them all serially in different places. And I think that was what was happening here. I think he was serializing 2 or 3 different novels at the same time for pretty much the duration of publishing this. For doing that kind of thing, the fact that there is so much of this work that is so well put together, so well planned out, so well plotted, and so well foreshadowed, and the twists are so good and, make so much sense, they're not dissatisfying, is a real testament to the quality of the work. The characters are almost all super engaging as well, and I think the wrap-up for the first 2 major plot arcs, about 200 pages before the end, is also one of my favorite things as well, because there's, I would say, probably 4 major plot lines throughout the back half of the book that go on, and the wrap-up of 2 of those are amazing. The wrap-up of one of those is fine, and the wrap-up of the other wasn't quite as satisfying as I wanted it to, but we'll talk about that in a moment. In terms of the bad for The Count of Monte Cristo, an aspect to the ending is pretty much the main thing that I didn't love about the book. One particular character that I wanted to see on screen more in the last couple hundred pages wasn't on screen, even though you assume that you assume the reveal that is associated with that particular aspect, but I did want to see that particular thread wrapped up a little bit more on the page, as opposed to relegated to being at the very end, and then just all of a sudden it's just like, oh, here's the reveal. But that was just one of the 4 major plot lines in the majority of the novel that I had a problem with in terms of the wrap up, or how it was wrapped up, because it wasn't on page as much as I wanted it to be. As I've mentioned, 4 major plot lines for the majority of the novel. Those last 2, one of them that I just got through talking about, that comprise the last couple hundred pages, just aren't exactly my favorite. Although the comeuppance of one of those characters was glorious in the moment, even if the lead up wasn't fantastic. So even the stuff that I don't necessarily love quite as much, there's still aspects to those plot lines that are really good, because these plot lines last for hundreds upon hundreds of pages, so it's hard for any of them to feel like they're fully underdeveloped, even if there's maybe like a small decision or 2 that maybe I would have done a little bit differently. Being most of my problem, like, it's generally small stuff like that. the characters that aren't engaging in the book, one of the things that is really good about Count of Monte Cristo is that everything is so engaging. The problem that I had with this is the fact that the characters that aren't engaging are so unmemorable, it is unbearable. One of the four major plot lines follows a family full of those characters. Like, there's just one of these plot lines that has many characters that just, their standout moments are few and far between, and when they're not actively on the page, you forget they exist. It's disappointing that there's one of these plot lines that has that problem. But the other three don't have that problem, so I guess that kind of says something about how good it is anyway. And then one of the things that I think most people can agree on with the book is that there is a subplot shortly after the first act, those first 300 pages in this copy of the book, that is a bit of a change from what came before it, the Rome subplot, that I think a lot of people consider to be the worst part of the book, or at least their least favorite part of the book. And I would say I disagree. I actually really liked the Rome subplot, but many people think it is their least favorite. But that is only until you get to the point where it's actually important. The subplot is important with characters and other moments to come later in the novel that it all becomes worth the read, even if you do find that section a little bit slow in comparison. In terms of the ugly, there's a couple things that just kind of come with the reputation of the book that I do want to comment on here. One of those is that you probably heard that this is the quintessential revenge story, and in a lot of ways that is absolutely the truth, and I totally see why people feel that way. But for me, I think the most memorable part of the book, being the first 300 pages, means that the stuff that I remember forefront from the book isn't necessarily the revenge aspects, but the revenge aspects are all really good. How they're all wrapped up are all really cool, and you feel, connected to them as a result of some of the characters. And on this sort of aspect as well, I feel like certain readers put a little bit too much weight on the mystery of who the Count is, because to me it was very obvious from the moment he was introduced, and based off of the first act being what it is very, very obvious who the Count is, but I feel like people act like they don't know who he is for a very long time. It's like, is it really not that obvious? Am I just a genius? Because I'm not a genius. Like, I just feel like that mystery has a little bit too much weight put on it. I won't spoil it explicitly, but if you're thinking critically at all, I do think it's really easy to spot who the answer to that question is, and I was so underwhelmed by that element because of how people spoke about it. Like, people made it out to be like, oh, it's, the mystery of the entire book, and it's like, 5 pages after this character was introduced, I was pretty sure I knew who exactly it was, and I was right for the entire time. But that's just kind of a personal qualm. In terms of the recommendation, absolutely read this one. The complaints that I made about the book are minor in the grand scheme of things. I still rated it 5 stars. They weren't enough to bring back or bring down what I thought was great. And this is a common favorite classic for people, or at least appearing on a list of people's favorite classics. It appears there a lot. It is fantastic, and this Robin Buss translation is so incredibly readable that nobody should have issues with it, I think. It's one of those books that, despite its lengths, is one that's like, if you're interested in trying out classics, read Count of Monte Cristo. Like, make that one of your first ones. Make it your first one, maybe. Like, it's long, but it is really good. It is really high quality. There aren't that many people who overall dislike it. There are people that maybe have issues with that Rome subplot, like I said, because it's a little bit slower, maybe seems a little bit irrelevant at first, but once some of that stuff becomes more relevant and you get further into the back half, you understand why it's there, you understand how it's important, and then you just don't really complain about it too much because you understand it. It makes sense, and therefore doesn't become bad anymore in your mind. It's also rather fast-paced between the independent sections, despite the length of it as well. For me, I read the first 200 or so pages of this in January, I think, of 2023 or so. And then I finished all of the rest of it over March of 2023. So the last like 900 pages I read in March of 2023. So it does go rather quick. I'm a slow reader. I say this all the time on the channel, but even I was able to get through, the vast majority of this in a month. And I wanted to because it was so good. I did burn myself out on reading some stuff because of that decision, but it is a very good book. So there you have it. I have no clue why I didn't get this one reviewed as soon as I finished it, like I did with some of the other classics I've gotten through for this year, but take this review anyway. It might be upwards of a month after or a year after I read the book that that the video actually comes out, but I am reviewing this just a few months later. So yeah, it is a very great book. I recommend it. I think basically everybody who's read the full book would recommend it as well. It is incredible. Despite its length, I think it would make a fantastic introduction into other classics. I know plenty of people who don't really read classic books for the most part, who have read Count of Monte Cristo and love it. So that would speak for itself. Thank you guys for watching. I have no clue what's coming next, just as I had no clue what was coming next for some of these other reviews that have come out this year. But thank you guys for watching. I'll see you in the next video.